Share screen, do I want to press?
Nope. Well, let me introduce you first. Hello, everybody. This is Tammy. Thanks for me coming out on a Thursday night. This is awesome. We have a great crew of members right now, Mr. Steve. And I cannot wait till the end so we can hear how many of you were at the 1939 World's Fair. Were you we don't have to ask how old you were, but we want to hear some of your stories. And I'm excited. We've all been waiting for this lecture. And Steve, I appreciate you coming by on a Thursday night. So let's go for it, everybody. Now Steve can share his screen. All right.
That should be it, right?
Yes. Yep, you got it.
Okay, so tonight I'm going to talk about the 1939 World's Fair. If this were an in-person lecture, the first question would be, raise your hand if you were at the fair, but probably not going to work under these. So there I go, I see a bunch of them now. I'm sure there's going to be a lot. I've done this lecture a couple of times, and there are always a number of people remembering it, telling stories about it. I may tell you one or two stories. I did not. I went to the '64 World Series. So let's see where this is. Okay. Let me get up here. All right. I have to move this thing on the side here. Let me get rid of this. No, that's not it. Okay, great. So in 1936, the New York Times wrote, the exhibits and amusements covering 1,200 acres, key to the theme of building the world of tomorrow, are being planned with a view to a total investment of $125 million and are expected to attract 50 million people in a year's time, with a daily maximum capacity of 800,000. So you can see that the expectations are quite high. Now, one of the important things to focus on with regard to the 1939 World's Fair, don't forget what's on the screen right now. It was an odd time for a World's Fair, odd or difficult in the sense that it was the middle of the Great Depression. It was very difficult times financially, and it was on the world was on the precipice of war. So there were all kinds of different factors with regard to how this was going to be. But in 1935, a group of businessmen decided that the city needed something to jumpstart businesses. They thought a World's Fair would excite the public and increase jobs. Group founded the New York World's Fair Corporation. Corporation raised $27 million. And with a new mayor, Fiorello LaGuardia, you might remember the name, and a new Parks Commissioner, Robert Moses, also a well-known figure in New York City, the project moved forward. Fiorello worked with FDR and brought in federal money. Countries and corporations raised money. And the city was promised the 1,200 acres on which the fair would take place for a park when the fair ended. Robert Moses was the Parks Commissioner, and his whole, or at least in the early years, one of his passions was building parks in New York City. And what you see here is a mountain of ash. Power was generated mostly by coal fire at this point in time. And the coal produces ashes, and it's got to be dump sites. So they dumped it in this open space in Corona, Queens. And before they could have the fair, they needed to level the ground. And Scott Fitzgerald called the ash dump the Valley of Ashes. In The Great Gatsby, he described the hellish scene, bounded on one side by a small foul river, a fantastic farm where ashes grow like wheat into ridges and hills and grotesque gardens. So you could see how ugly and foul Fitzgerald thought about the ash mound. But they did go to groundbreaking. The groundbreaking ceremony took place on June 3rd, 1936. And in the picture here, You might recognize Fiorello LaGuardia on the left and Grover Whalen holding the shovel. He was the president of the fair, and it's essentially the prime money man during this period. And that's what it looked like, the fair construction. You can see the beginnings, the outline of the fair. 1938. Why would I have Lou Gehrig in this lecture? Look on his shoulder. On the shoulder of every Yankee, Dodger, and New York Giants had a patch on their sleeve advertising the 1939 World's Fair. And there you see Lou Gehrig with the trilon and the perisphere, the symbols of the 1939 fair. And this is just somebody advertising. Even the United States government advertised the New York World's Fair of 1939 with a 3-cent stamp. And opening day was April 30th, 1939. That day was picked because it's the 150th anniversary of George Washington's inauguration in 1789, which, as you probably know, but I know none of you were at this inauguration. You might know that he was inaugurated in New York City and was the first president to actually live in New York City. And this statue of George Washington is the largest statue in the 1939 World's Fair. And there were two parts to the fair. The first half of the 1939 World's Fair ran from April 30th, 1939 to October 31st, 1939, the World of Tomorrow. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. So even before the first season is over, you get the beginning of World War II. The fair reopened on May 11th, 1940 and closed on October 27th, 40. And the theme changed because the world had changed. It changed for peace and freedom. And by the way, the 1939 World's Fair was not an official World's Fair. There was a bureau, the Bureau of International Expositions, which was in Paris, and they sanctioned World's Fair. They did not sanction the New York World's Fair because no World's Fair was allowed to have two sessions, which was the plan in New York and what they did. So both 1939 and 1964 World's Fair were not sanctioned World's Fairs. This is just one of the gates there, the Corona Gate, and that's a boulevard, clock on top. The gates, there were 15 of them, and there were parking lots that could service 35,000 cars and buses. So there was lots of transportation facilities. 206,000 people visited on opening day. And the first sign that things wouldn't be quite as good, 500,000 people were expected. So less than half showed up. Very hot day. Admission on opening day was 75 cents. Most exhibits were a quarter. Now that sounds like expensive, cheap, but it wasn't. If you spend $20, which was multiplied by 10.5 times to become $20, the exhibits would be equal to $370. And thousands of people heard and saw FDR's speech on the 200 television sets on the grounds. And here's a picture of the FDR, the president, and Fiorello, the mayor, and there's Eleanor Roosevelt, and that's Herbert Lehman on the front of the car. He was the governor. And of the 200,000, about 35,000 people sat in the stands to hear FDR's speech. And if we were lucky, let's see if we're going to get this. I don't know. Let's see if you can hear this.
No, you would have to share the audio with us from your computer in the options on the shared screen. Do you see that? If you click on view options at the top, there's a drop-down box that would be share audio. Steve, do you hear me? Steve, do you hear me? Steve, we can't hear you anymore.
So that was FDR officially opening the first sessions of the 1939 World's Fair. He also was there when they opened the second half of the 1939 World's Fair. There were 150 exhibits over the 1,200 acres. The pavilions were divided into zones. I'm not going to go through each of them. And the zones were separated by fountains, pools, sculptures. It was a beautiful setting for the fair. This is the lagoon with the pavilions of the various nations around the back. And as you can see, it's probably a cooler day because everybody's got some jackets and hats and sweaters on. And then you get the two major structures at the World's Fair, the Trilon and the Perisphere. The Perisphere being the round circle there, and the Trilon being the higher piece. They were right in the center of the fair, and all the streets and so forth ran out from the sometimes called the spike in the ball. The Trilon was three-sided, 610 feet tall. The Unisphere, for instance, from the 1964 World's Fair, is on the exact spot that the Trilon occupied. Inside the Perisphere, 180 feet in diameter, was a diorama of democracy. It showed the city of the future. The World's Fair essentially was trying to show the city and the world as it was or would be in the 1960s. Rather than look backwards, which a lot of World's Fair did, the 1939 World's Fair looked forward. And what you saw was a circular city with a moving sidewalk, shopping malls, highways, lots of cars, no windows or people in the diorama. And that's what it looked like in an aerial view. And this is what the Democracy, the name of the show inside the Perisphere was. And you see the people on the side, they're standing there, and the balconies they're on turn and go through the entire circle, 6-minute show for it. And you can see, and this, if you can hear it for just a second, I'm not going to leave this on too long. This song concluded the Democracy.
Steve, we can't hear the sound.
You can't hear the sound?
Not very good.
All right, okay, I'm going to just go by, I'm sorry. And this is the New York State Building. When they were building the World's Fair, they had to cross over some roads and so forth, and they built this enormous ramp, which allowed for the taking or the use of getting goods and building materials for the fair. The New York State Building was the administration building for the fair. And this is the New York City Building, which was built for the fair. If you see the structure here, you see the long and then the little anchors on the end. At one point in time, there was a roller rink on one side and an ice skating rink on the other. So it was an interesting building. It's one of the few buildings from the 1939 World's Fair that still exists. It has now been changed as of 1972. The building is used as the Queen's Museum, which is a if you've ever been, it's a fabulous museum. And it also contains a panorama of New York City, millions of buildings in this little panorama of New York City. And from 1946 to 1950, the New York City building housed the United Nations. The buildings in Manhattan on First Avenue, just north of 42nd Street, were in the process of being built. Robert Moses convinced them to have their meetings at the New York City building. He had hoped that the UN would be built on these grounds, but it didn't occur. And this is just a picture of the Queen's Museum as it exists today. And this is the helicline, which took people from the Trilon to the Perisphere. And it was it's the highest walkway on the fair. It was about 50 feet high. So people would walk, they could see the entire grounds, and it was a wonderful place for taking pictures. And in June of 1939, King George VI and Queen Elizabeth visited the fair. This just tells you how essentially important an event was, that the Queen and the King came to the United States specifically to visit the World's Fair. And there they are walking along, and you could see the large crowds. And this is the lagoon, and there's 4 statues that you can see, and it's just a nice picture with the Trilon in the back, the Perisphere, and the image of George Washington. The statue is actually there. And the 4 freedoms being freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, and freedom of religion. This is from the words of FDR. And this is the United States building. In this building, one of the things you could have seen was one of the original copies of the US Constitution. Hall of Nations, there were 63 nations that participated. The League of Nations building, by 1939, the League of Nations was essentially worthless and just vanished during the Second World War. This is the Italian Pavilion. There was a big waterfall in front. Ultimately, Italy left the 1939 World's Fair because, if you recall, they were allies of Mussolini early on, then left that, but the bad taste was already in about Italy. Poland, of course, was invaded by the Germans, and Poland was first. And after the invasion, the Polish statue in the front of it was draped in black, just as a recognition of what had happened. Germany, by the way, did not have a pavilion, did not come to the 1939 World's Fair. They claimed it had to do with finances. And then there was the Russian pavilion, which was the largest pavilion during the 1939 World's Fair. It's the statue of Joe at the top, he being a worker, a common man, as they saw it. And it was a huge structures that they built there. You can see this. This is all the Russian pavilion, to the 2 sides and in the great circle inside. They closed down at the end of the early 1939 session, and that property was immediately demolished. And then they just had a big open square where the Russian pavilion was. And in the Russian pavilion inside, you would see the statues of Lenin and Stalin celebrating their leaders. And here's the Vatican Pavilion. And this is obviously inside the church part of it. And this is what it looked like at night. It had this little glow that came out, looked like a halo or something, just emphasizing the holy nature of the pavilion. In 1964, the Vatican would actually allow the Pietà to come to the United States. They sent some artwork and so forth to the 39. And then there's the British Pavilion. The Brits, of course, were great friends. And in the British Pavilion, I don't think it, go back to the British, in the British Pavilion, they showed and brought over one of the original copies of the Magna Carta, one of the great historic artifacts. And in 1940, they left the Magna Carta in the United States, and it was kept in Fort Knox until 1947, just to protect it against any attacks in Britain. That the U.S. also had the U.S. Constitution at Fort Knox during that period. And there's the Irish Pavilion. You could look at the top. This is what it looked like. It looks like a shamrock. There were, lots of different architecture there, and they tried to demonstrate or show whatever the specific artifacts and so forth of each of the different pavilions. Australia, this is sheep wool in the building. And you had the China Pavilion. They were still allies of us. And the Jewish Palestine Pavilion. Obviously, there was no Israel in 1939, but certainly it was moving in that direction. And on the facade of the building, you can see in the lower left, there's a sculpture here, and this is the sculpture, the scholar, the laborer, and the toiler of soil. This is was a very a recognizable sculpture. And there's a picture of Albert Einstein, who went to the fair a number of times, leaving the Palestine Pavilion. And Czechoslovakia, this is their building. Czechoslovakia was also invaded by the Germans, and they too covered their statue in black. Japan, who they would not too long before they're at war with the United States. And here, this is a room of a lot of artifacts, paintings, various things, and it's dedicated to eternal peace and friendship between America and Japan. Well, that didn't quite work out. And then you had the Court of States. 23 of the states participated. The reason the others did, it was just too expensive for some of the states. And so here's just a couple of them. This you might guess, Florida, by the colors, shapes. There you see Ponce de Leon and the Fountain of Youth. I was there about 2 years ago. I drank from the fountain. I didn't really drank from the Fountain of Youth, but you can get something nearby. It didn't help me at all. This is the Pennsylvania construction there. This is supposed to be Independence Hall there. Quite a large pavilion. And inside you got this time table, timeline of the history, and obviously Pennsylvania being one of the prominent early colonies and then states. New Jersey, I show you that because I'm from New Jersey, nothing else of value. Then you had the community interest zone, and that focused on industries and trade of mass appeal, art gardens, gas industries, textiles, jewelry, medicine, etc. Each of the zones had some focus. And this is, you had the medicine and public health building, and it was in a period when there was a lot of experiment with sulfa drugs, anesthetics, and some of the work on polio was beginning. And then there was the town of the future, And there are actually 15 model homes shown at the fair. And each of those homes would have cost about $5,000. And the home of the future has some deco feeling to it. All of this is focusing on how good things will be. I mean, they're looking, and they're in the middle or towards the end of the Depression. They didn't know the end was coming because they didn't know war was coming. But the whole idea of this is this would make life easier than it was. And so everybody could get a bathroom like this. And there too was the Remington, the advertisement for the Remington electric shaver. They're actually theoretically shaving the elephant. So these are all some of the new things during this period. And here's the dream of Venus. This is the Dolly exhibit. This was quite a controversial exhibit. You see this base in the front, and that was the ticket sales. You bought it there. And then theoretically, you walk into the exhibit under the legs of the woman, and that's Venus on the top, but you can see the legs surrounding where you would buy the tickets. And there were lots of controversy about it, and Dolly wrote his Declaration of the Independence of the Imagination and the Rights of Man to His Own Madness. And that sold a little bit. They had to tone down some of it. There were women, some of them topless in the pool there. They got that done, but it still remained quite a controversial part of the fair. And then they had the masterpieces of art, 35 galleries with paintings, sculpture, and murals. Just give you an example of the level of the artwork there. This is a Rembrandt self-portrait. These things were, borrowed from some of the great museums around the world. And the Works Progress Administration at WPA had its own pavilion, and they had murals showing the working man. And then you had the food zone. Of course, this was a popular one. The food zone had 40 sit-down restaurants and 261 individual food stands. They sold hamburgers, franks, and soda at 10 cents or less. Most international pavilions had a restaurant featuring native dishes. The two fanciest restaurants at the fair were the French pavilion and the Belgian pavilion. The French pavilion had the chef who actually opened up Le Pavillon in New York City, which was for many, many years the #1 French restaurant in New York. And Beechnut demonstrated how coffee is grown and produced. And then you get Heinz. I'm dying here to hear what people have to say. So what you see here is actually a pin. If you went into the Heinz pickle, you would have gotten a little slice of pickle and a pin, which showed the highs. And someone, I was a lecturer doing the same lecture a while ago, and a man raised his hand and said, I went to the fair when I was 10 years old with my 5th grade class, and my mother or my grandmother put a salami sandwich in a brown bag, and I had it in my pocket, and it was an extraordinarily hot day, and it stunk. People kept walking away from him. But this was one of the, they gave away tens of thousands of these pins, and you can still buy them on the internet. It's just a not expensive remembrance of the 1939 fair. And here's the Belgian restaurant. They were fancy. Most of the restaurants were not as white coated and crystal as other restaurants in the fair. And then Swift Meats, they had, I guess, the shape of the building. It's like like a hot dog, I guess. And this shows women in there. They're actually live in there, and they're packaging the meat products for the Swift company. And then the Borden, Elsie the Borden, they actually had a contest for the nicest cow. They had about 150 cows, and Elsie won. And she then became a big star, an advertising star. But they actually, at the fair, had that. And this is a rotolactor. This was, as far as I know, the first automatic milking of cows. And you can see it goes around the circle, and the guy's attaching the fixture to the udder, and they're getting the milk. So these are all things that are moving forward. This is the electric utility pavilion. This is a huge waterfall, and you walk essentially through the waterfall by a covered walkway. And for whatever reason, people were fascinated by the idea of walking through the water. And then Wonder Bread, which became, obviously, I guess you can still buy Wonder Bread in some places. And this is what one of the little stands, where you're getting a hot dog or a hamburger, a drink for 10 cents, place to sit down. And then raw materials we use to produce finished products. You got Con Ed, DuPont, Eastman Kodak, Elgin watches. They're all part of this. Is probably the most popular of the various things. And here's Westinghouse, and you see this crowd up front. And I'll show you the figure on stage there that everybody's looking at. It was Electro. He was a robot that could speak and walk a little. He spoke for 700 words. And this is the General Electric. You see the lighting here in Westinghouse next to it. And then the washing machine. These are all, this is going to be, especially for women as they advertised it, it was going to make life easier. They had a washing machine. They had a dishwasher. All of them were promoted at the World's Fair. But actually, as you were leaving the World's Fair, there was an appliance store. You could have bought some of these things. And there's a refrigerator. This looks a little more modern. And DuPont had one of the wonders of the world, and their big item was nylon, strong as steel, as fine as a spider's web. And there it is, a woman trying on the nylons. Cost $1.35 at the fair. And in today's money, the $1.35 would be equal to about a little over $20. So they're expensive. And then probably one of the other major items that were there was a time capsule. Westinghouse put it right outside their pavilion. And the time capsule was supposed to be open in 5,000 years. So what do you put in a time capsule? It's buried 50 feet underground near the site of the Westinghouse building. And by the way, in 1964, they also buried a time capsule for another $5,000 years. So it's to be opened in the year 6939. And some of the items buried include a fountain pen, 75 types of fabrics, metals, plastic, modern literature, current events, a motion picture projector, with instructions, because probably nobody would use one, Cupid doll, cigarettes, $1 and change, a Gillette safety razor, some writings of Albert Einstein and Thomas Mann, and again, a pack of Camel cigarettes. So that's the kind of thing they put into this capsule to be opened in 5,000 years. Kodak had its pavilion. It was the first early colorized film and so forth. And these things rotated, the pictures rotated around. AT&T building was popular, and amazingly to some people, or most people, you could call to people all around the world. And there were free calls, there were lines for the calls. You kind of see to the right of the post there, somebody using the phone to call essentially anywhere in the world. Now a phone like that almost is obsolete. And then you had Pedro the Voder. What they have here is the first machine that talked. It was a synthesizer. One woman, this woman who's sitting there in the middle, actually using what's almost like a typewriter, manipulated all the changes. There was a record in there, a record from a record player, and they had, but it was not people speaking. Actually, it was the sound coming from the machine itself. And this is one of the pavilions was National Cash Register, and you see the cash register there, and what they're measuring up at the top is the number of people who entered the fair that day. And Con Ed's City of Light, see, the enormous amount of electricity used in all these things. And this is the Bessemer Steel Company, U.S. Steel, United States Steel, showing you the Bessemer process and how steel is actually made. And then the transportation zone. General Motors featured Futurama, one of the most popular exhibits at the fair. It had 600 moving seats that took passengers around a 36,000 square foot vision of the future. 15-minute ride depicted cars, skyscrapers, 14-lane highways with cars going 100 miles an hour. Come tour the future with General Motors. Everybody got a pin, 27,000 a day, and the pin said, "I have seen the future." And again, there were also auto dealers on the grounds of the fair. And you could see the lines going into Futurama. And you see the size of the buildings and so forth. And the people sitting in their chairs as they're going around. I think somebody earlier, before we began, talked about this ride, Futurama. Again. And then there was the Pontiac Plastic Car. You could actually see inside to see the workings of the car. People were fascinated by the parts of and the construction of the car. So Pontiac made with what they called the ghost car for people to observe. And the Ford Motor Company, beautiful building they had. And their exhibit, rather than essentially the cars themselves initially, were all the parts that go into it. Rather than looking into the car, they just put on demonstration all of the parts that went into the construction of the cars. And then they had cars going up and down the ramps around the roof and all the way down, and professional drivers, race car drivers, part of the show. And then Crosley, I'm sorry, was a big manufacturer. They manufactured everything: radios, cameras, cars, gas and electric ranges, electric ironers, everywhere. Crosley dealers, I don't think they exist anymore, but they were quite a factor in all these products. Chrysler Building. So you see all the major car dealers or car producers use these as sales, and in some cases try to show the modern, what the future is. Aviation Building, I mean, air travel was not, it was only in the beginning of its ages, and so the pavilion itself is shaped like an airplane, and you see the planes. And the American Airlines DC-3, they actually had a plane there that people could walk into because it was too expensive for most people, but they got the opportunity to feel what it was like. The DC-3 actually had been in service for a couple of years by 1939. Firestone factory, obviously they made tires. And at the fair, US Royal built this huge tire, and it is a Ferris wheel. You can see the cars along the outside of it. After the fair was over, somebody from Michigan, some company from Michigan, bought it, and it is still visible along one of the highways in Michigan. The railroad pageant, you have to remember that the railroad was still a major transportation factor in 1939. They had a huge pageant featuring, among other things, the women of the future, and they had some of the biggest engines in the world at the fair. It was a very popular, because it was a spectacular exhibition. And then, of course, you had RCA and television. And this is the RCA pavilion. And there's David Sarnoff, the head of RCA, talking to the news and touting their television set with from 5 to 12-inch monitors. You see people here sitting around. There were about 250 monitors around the grounds. And in one of them, you could see yourself as you walk by. And then the amusement zone, which was among the more popular zones on the thing, on the grounds of the fair. One of them was the parachute tower, they called it. They didn't call it a parachute tower. They didn't call it I'm missing my word here, I'm sorry. But it was the parachute tower rather than the parachute jump. And I guess if you know, most of you might know, that the parachute tower at the end of the fair was moved to Coney Island. And the area which it was put was bought by Fred Trump. He wanted to tear it down, but they landmarked it. That is, the city landmarked it, and the tower is still there in Coney Island. For years, it just rotted away, but in recent years, they've painted it, and they're not going to use it as a parachute jump, but at night, it is nicely lit up and so forth. And they had a bobsled. And then Billy Rose's Aquacade, again, one of the more popular exhibits at the fair. Synchronized swimming, 10,000 or 11,000 wooden seats at the Aquacade. And one of the other things that made it popular was the, I guess in simplest terms, scantily dressed women who were doing the swimming and prancing around. And there's an advertisement for Billy Rose's Aquacade, and you see it's a for those days a somewhat sexy picture. And let me just as a side, just about every World's Fair has had naked or partially naked or scantily dressed, whatever you want to call it, women in one or another of their exhibits. Gypsy Rose Lee, for instance, in the Chicago Fair. And this was actually in the 1939 World's Fair. It was called the Sun Worshipers Garden. It was in the second half of the fair. The second half of the fair got a little looser than the first. They were more willing. But these were women, as you can see, with their tops exposed for the most part. And there were fences around, so nobody could come up or go in there and touch anyone, but pictures were taken, and it was somewhat popular. There was also a pavilion where you could go upstairs, or presumably a man would go upstairs and take a picture with a topless woman, and then that picture would be transposed onto a magazine cover. Like you could have theoretically a Life magazine with a cover showing X-Man and topless woman. The line was quite long at that place. Then you had the Water Bug, which was kind of like bumper cars, but it was on the water. You also had a roller coaster. Then you had a tragedy on July 4th, 1940. Somebody, and nobody has ever identified the perpetrators, planted a bomb at the fair and killed 2 people in front of the British Pavilion. The bomb was in a suitcase, and 2 policemen actually were killed. And so when the fair closed on October 27th, 1940, by then World War II was pretty much in full action. Obviously, the United States wasn't there yet, but they were soon to be. And the fair, things had slowed down. The fair was a financial failure. World War II started as before in 1939. And again, you went from the Depression to war. So the whole concept of the 1939 World's Fair was defined in part by what was happening around the world. And the trilon, excuse me, and the perisphere were taken down in 1941, and 40 million tons of steel went to the war effort. So they took it down and they used it to build ships and whatever else. And this is one of the pins at the 1930, given away, well, you had to buy them, I guess, 1939 World's Fair. So if you were a good person, well-behaved child or adult, you could buy this at the New York World's Fair in 1939. And for those who are Mets fans or knows about Mets fans, the Mets colors are very much like the 1939 pin, which is the orange and blue. And that is my lecture for today. And I would love to hear people's reminiscences and so forth. Anyone, tell me what you loved about, not about me necessarily, but about the fair.
First of all, I enjoyed what you have told us and shown us. But the World's Fair, one of the things that was very impressive at that World's Fair was telephones.
I talked very briefly, I mentioned AT&T.
And it was radically different from anything that we had known up to that time.
Yeah, and you could at the time make a long distance phone call for free. And I would say only one other thing. That phone is obsolete, and the phones we're using now will be obsolete 100 years. You'll have it yeah, embedded in your body somehow, and so forth. But thank you. I mean, I love hearing what people have, what interests them, and the fair was so large. And one of the women here, I hope she describes again, said that she had gone with 29 times.
Wow.
I think
So-
that was Mrs. Fader. Are you still here, Mrs. Fader? Buzzy Fader. I think she's. Oh.
I heard she's still there. I don't know if she can hear you. I see. Yeah, she's waving.
And then Faye, you wanted, Mrs. Diamond, did you want to remark on?
Well, I remember my father bought a book of 10 admissions for $10. I only went twice, 3 times, I should say, but the first time started on my graduation, my high school graduation. I headed a daisy chain on the day of my graduation. The job of the daisy chain was to lead the graduates down the auditorium to their seats. Well, after graduation, we were taken to the World's Fair, and that was in June 1940. And there was some contest that I won.
Oh, okay.
Through the school. I got a $10 gift certificate and a red cellophane envelope. There was no plastic at that time, with a card, first prize. It was $10 from a Martin's department store in Brooklyn. If people from Brooklyn, it was like a miniature Fifth Avenue.
Yes.
And my mother got me an outfit for like $12.95 there. However, from there, we were taken from the graduation exercise, we were taken to the World's Fair. So I didn't get to see much that day. We had that contest. I don't know what it was. I won a daisy chain contest, a personality. I just don't remember. And I did go there twice after that, once with a friend and once my mother. But the outstanding, you mentioned the World of Tomorrow, the Futurama, that was really outstanding. That I remember vividly. I also remember going into some bullet type of a car, very sleek, and you saw wonderful murals on each side. And this was to show the future, how you could overcome traffic congestion. Well, that never came into being, unfortunately. Did Robert Moses have anything to do with that? I know he was
Robert Moses
visionary.
Robert Moses is a story in and of itself, but he had something to do with everything. And the deal he made, or the city made, is that they leveled the ground and prepared it for the 1939 World's Fair in exchange for the land, which Robert Moses wanted to make a park. And ultimately, after the 1964 World's Fair, he got his wish. And the Flushing Corona Park is, a huge park. I think it's either the first or second largest park in New York City. And he got his way. Then he moved on from parks to roads, slum clearance. I mean, he was a factor every way during his career. Somewhat disparaged at the end, but he was a big person. And with Fiorello LaGuardia's friendship with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, because Fiorello LaGuardia had been a congressman prior to being mayor, and he knew him from Washington. He was able to get a lot of federal money, and a lot of that money went to projects that Robert Moses had wanted. Okay.
David and Susan, did you have something to say? And then Mr.
Yes. I went to the World's Fair in the summer of 1940. I was not quite 5 years of age. My mother and I went to New York to visit my father's sister and the family. The most I remember, other than the trial on at Paris Fair, the way we went to New York and back was by boat.
Okay.
And in those days, there was a boat that left Rose Wharf in Boston every night at 5 o'clock. And a boat left New York at 5 o'clock, and they reached the other city at about 8 o'clock in the morning. 7 days a week. That was the thrill of my life, that boat ride with my mother. I remember the Parker House roll for breakfast. Wow.
I'm going to mention someone's name as a resident of your same facility, Sid Friedman. I don't know if you know Sid, but he was telling me the other day that he went when he was 5 years old. That, you know, he went with his mother, and for him, the most outstanding thing was the aquacade, Billy Rose's aquacade. For whatever reason, that was the thrilling event. And I can remember, I mean, I didn't go to 1939, not that I'm that young, by the way, but I love to hear the stories. I mean, I think that all of those people, a lot of the people who were surveyed after the fair closed, and it lost a lot of money, but percentage-wise, it lost less money than the 1964 World's Fair in reality. But 75 cents was too expensive.
It
I know
was.
that sounds absurd
You think of that. It
to
was.
us, but it really mattered to people. And when asked, the majority of people, when asked why they didn't go to the fair, said because it was too expensive.
That it's funny. When we went, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. When we went, it was the Long Island Railroad put a station there. I was 4 years old. I remember so much of it. Of course, I went so many times, but I guess for my parents, getting there was easy because of the Long Island Railroad. And it was a lot of walking. I remember we walked all over. There were a lot of fountains, which helped with the heat. I remember something with a dishwasher, and they had sort of a woman is sitting and reading a magazine while her dishes are getting cleaned. And that, I'm 4 years old. I still remember that as a monumental event. That
was part of the whole idea.
With all the modern, and I
when
told you, when you sat on that chair and you moved around, what you looked at was cars riding on parkways.
Theoretically about 100 miles an hour.
Well, I don't know about speed, but it was cars were going up and down and then overpasses, things like that. We'd never seen anything like that. That I remember as well. These kind of stuck in the modern things. Mr. Pickle stood outside.
Mr. Pickle, yep. And you got a little slice of pickle. Did you get your little slice of pickle?
I don't remember that, but I remember Mr. Pickle. And then, of course, I had the pin. I guess I had a lot of pins because we went so often. Trying to think of we have pictures where we're all in front of the fountains and in front of the Trialon and Paris Fair.
As far as you went on the train, but they also made a subway station.
I don't remember that.
At that, yeah, they did, and I could give you some context of right where you get off the subway at that station. If you go to the USTA, the tennis center in Queens, you get off the train, you got to walk along like a boardwalk. That's exactly where the train stops. And that goes back to 1939, which was built specifically for the 1939 World's Fair.
Call from
And just again, another context thing. On the property that was the World's Fair, Corona Park, you have the USTA Tennis Center, Billie Jean King Tennis Center, and you have Citi Field where the Mets play. Both of those facilities are on the land that was for the 1939 World's Fair.
Yeah.
Anyone else? I love the stories. I might quote you someday. Okay.
Well, we have 50 people on here. Did they do any comparison with the with Epcot Center and the World of Tomorrow? Is there any relation?
Yeah, there is. There's a lot. In many ways, the 1939 World's Fair was the beginning in the United States of the whole thing. Epcot had a lot of looking forward. from 1964, it's even more pronounced because in 1964, Walt Disney had 5 shows going at the 1964 World's Fair. So the whole beginning for the whole Epcot, Disneyland, et cetera, come directly from 1964. But he also, nobody knows for sure whether he went to 1939. He certainly could have, but a lot of the ideas came from 1939. So there's a pretty good line between 1939 and Epcot and Disneyland and Disney World and all that. And Disney has a lot to do with it.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Anybody else? We got a little bit of extra time.
Come on, I want more stories. I love every one of them, truthfully.
Can you hear me, Steve?
Yeah.
What was the New York City building eventually became a roller rink and
Yes.
ice skating rink
On either side.
on either side. And we used to go there when I was a kid to go rollerblading or ice skating.
Yes.
And it was an interesting thing to do.
Yeah, it was. The building was actually built for the 1939 World's Fair.
Yes.
And
But it was an item that was not demolished.
no, it's not demolished because it becomes ultimately the Queen's Museum.
Also, what was I forget the name, the tower was set up where helicopters could land, and that became a restaurant. It's been
That's the next. That's not 1939, no.
Oh, sorry.
That's, yeah, no. They didn't. I don't know. I don't even know if they had helicopters in 1939. But I know it was a heliport.
Yes.
Yeah, and that was in the '64 World's Fair. That was run by some New York City agency, actually. And it was popular, but it was expensive, just like it is today. You know, unless you want to spend a couple of $1,000s, you know, I don't know if it's that much anymore, but that was '64. But there were lots of cars in '39, as I said in the little talk there were 35,000 parking spots. For some of them, you had to cross the cross county road, but that's what it is today.
The Billy Rose area where he had his aquacade,
Yeah.
that eventually became a municipal swimming pool.
Yes.
So
And Billy Rose is quite the figure. I mean, he had quite the career as a producer, writer, you know, of shows and so forth. He had
Israel.
When the 1964 World's Fair got in trouble financially, they asked Billy Rose to take over the financial part of it. And he said something like, isn't that exact words, but it'll make it understanding. Essentially said, I'd shoot myself first rather than take over the fair. And they fooled around in '64 in particular, booking all the ticket sales, even from the second half and the first half, so it looked like it was doing well, but it wasn't. That's for another day.
They had a good accountant.
Well, I guess if that's a good accountant, they brought in a couple of different people and they did, as I said, they did a little better percentage-wise in 1939 and 1964. That was a disaster.
About Robert Moses.
No, he's
no, just in general.
In general, the whole infrastructure of much of New York and the surroundings had something to do with Robert Moses. I mean, almost all the highways were his, and he had some. He had one of his plans was to build a overpass that went essentially from the Brooklyn right across Manhattan, from the East River to the to the other side. And it would have, Greenwich Village would have been essentially taken out.
Right. Eventually.
And then he's also responsible for, a lot of it was under the premise of slum control. And there was a very active area which became
Interesting.
Lincoln Center, and it was called San Juan Hill, and it was just west of what's now Lincoln Center, and that was a African-American
Yeah, I
place.
reminded him of
And-
Robert Moses.
I'm sorry.
Oh, no, we have Anne's iPad has a question for you. Go ahead. Anne, I know you're unmuted, but Anne, you have,
It was a Robert Moses question started.
all right. Anne will,
How about another Ann? I wasn't at the 39 World's Fair, but I made Belgian waffles at the 64 World's Fair. And I had mentioned our last time, we got paid $1.50 an hour, nothing extra for overtime, and you loved every minute of it.
Well, Belgian waffles were a big hit at the 1964 World's Fair. I mean, of all the foods, that was probably the '1 surprise to everybody. It wasn't the first time, by the way, that Belgian waffles were sold. Just before it, about 1960, there was a World's Fair in Seattle, probably 61. And that was the debut of the Belgian waffle in the United States. They transported it to the fair in New York, and there's thousands of pictures, if you look them up, of people eating Belgian waffles. It's
and
good
then
to
it
make.
hurt.
Yeah.
Right, everybody?
Hello.
Who had a question? Was that you, Faye? Did you have something? All right. Anybody else? I'm going to stop
If
the.
I may continue with Robert Moses for a minute.
Sure.
He not only designed downstate, but if you go upstate in the Niagara Falls area, all those roads he designed and are named after him.
Yeah, I didn't know that, actually.
His genius was, if I make an amount of money to you, $10, $50, $1,000, you can picture that. But if you said to him, 10 million, 10 billion, he would say, 3 bridges, two tunnels. You could think
No, he was an
those
expert.
kind of terms that the average person could not believe that he could figure that out.
Yeah, he took advantage, though. If he wanted the property, he was also, by the way, just as another aside, the reason that the Dodgers and the Giants moved out of New York was Robert Moses. He refused to give up the land in Brooklyn, which would have saved those teams in New York. And now where they built the Barclays Center in Brooklyn, Atlantic Boulevard or Atlantic Gardens, is right where the Dodgers would have had a home field. But he refused. And there's no question that he was the decider in that. Somebody's waving. Buzzy.
Oh, this is Buzzy. Again, okay.
Yes,
You
Buzzy.
can just have to unmute yourself, Mrs. Fader.
Fader is.
Yep, Mrs. Fader, unmute yourself. Click the click your microphone. Click OK to unmute. I think she has to have help to unmute herself.
Okay.
But all right. Well, everybody, I'm going to stop the recording while Mrs. Vader tries to unmute, but thank you so much for coming. And I don't know if you guys, I know you have more topics, but I know you're going to be working on your golf game, and hopefully that's going well.
Yeah, on the touch screen. Oh.
Golf is not a game that you do well.
Oh,
You just
hello.
survive.
Yes,
Yes.
Mrs. Vader, what?
Okay, she fixed it. My daughter fixed it. When he decided that he did not want trucks on parkways, that's the reason why when you go out on Long Island, you can only go on the expressway with a truck. All the others have low overpasses over the parkways. And we're always getting trucks who are not allowed there. But if they come from out of town and don't know it, they get stuck. And then they have to back them out, or they lose all kinds of problems. Robert Moses, from then until today, has his effect on the parkways in New York.
There's no question. He'll essentially never be absent in terms of having something to do with the roads and passage, overpasses, bridges, tunnels. He had something to do with all of it. He was a controversial figure. But he got at certain points in time, he was the man. I mean, you didn't get anything done without him.
He got a lot done.
He got a lot done.
Yeah.
He did. Okay.
Thank you.
I think that's great. Thank you, everybody, for coming. If you guys are around on Sunday, we are going to be doing a pop-up a bingo night. So hope you guys can join me at 8 o'clock on this Sunday, and I'll resend the link out so you guys can get some bingo cards. But thank you so much, everybody. And I hope you had a great, night.
Yeah.
All righty. Thanks.
Good memory.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'll hear from you. I'll speak to you at